Thank you, Brother Terry, as always. Good evening. Yeah, he does a great job. He might learn how to play that thing one of these days. Appreciate you, brother. Good evening, all. Welcome to those that are online. Yeah, okay. There it is. This technology. I'm about to hold this thing. So anyway, while we're there, we're all this time looking. So they've got these big slides over there. They got a slide and they got this flume. So we thought, let's go over and see if Natalie's tall enough to ride. And so sure enough, she is. She's all excited. She's pumped. So we get up there and we get on the slide, and they have this mat you put on this slide, and you come down, and you splash down in the water and stuff like that. And so we did that a couple of times. And then they have this flume, which is just a tube, a big tube, okay? So Natalie decides, don't want to ride that one. That was a bit intimidating, so me and Harper decide to ride that thing. Well, I'd never been down that thing, never talked to anybody who had been. It's at Lake Winnipesaukee. It can't be much. You know what I mean? So we get on that thing and we wait in line, and so finally they put us on the raft and they push us off into this thing, and I'm expecting to go down through there, and there's some lights and something or other. I'm telling you, it was pitch black. You couldn't see anything. And it didn't take me long until we're in this thing. I'm like, this is going to be different. So we're going through there, and they got these sharp turns and all this kind of stuff. And the only thing close to light that is in a couple of these turns is that they've got what looks like coals from a fire, just the amber just basically glowing. I don't know if they're trying to imitate hell or what it was they were doing. So we're going down this thing, and we hit a couple of sharp turns, and then we go through around this one, like a 360, and this is all blind. You can't see nothing. It's kind of like, if you can see and anticipate, it's okay. You can't see anything. I'm not kidding. When I say pitch black, I mean pitch black. So we go around this 360, and then about that time after that 360, the bottom dropped out. And I mean, there was, I'm telling you, my heart jumped clean up to here. So I was telling Angela and Kim about it today, and they said, well, because Harper's in front of me. And they said, well, what was Harper screaming? I said, I don't know. I was screaming. I couldn't hear. So I'm telling you, it was an eye-opener, I can tell you that much. It was fun. Next time I'll know what to expect. Next time I'm going to close my eyes. All right, so take your Bibles, if you would, and open them with me to the book of Judges. And do what? Yes. Washington?
Yeah. It's amazing how much references there are to God.
Oh, yeah.
The Almighty, all over Washington. Yet we still today we won't even talk about it. We we come to this, we made up this separation of church and state, which is never, the only thing that was ever intended to do is keep the state from telling us what church we can go to. And but today, it's separation of church and state. You can't even bring up the name. It's all over Washington.
Yes.
It's all over our founding documents, everywhere.
Yeah.
It's amazing because, I mean, after he showed that last year and did this year, it's like, it is everywhere.
Yeah, last year focusing on the documents, founding documents and so forth, founding fathers, and then just like with this year, it was focusing up on memorials, statues and things to not necessarily politicians, but just individuals that have influenced our nation and people chosen by the states that they say, well, we want this person to represent us, and then all these quotes and so forth that come from them. So it's like I've said, you have to be just willfully ignorant, willfully blind to ignore the reality of the Judeo-Christian heritage of America. And, and of course, I'm surprised that the woke crowd hasn't tried to go and wipe all that stuff out too. But yeah, you're right. It's undeniable. You just have to completely ignore it not to realize that it's there. So. All right, so Judges chapter 2 and 3. We're going to get into, as you see, the introduction to the book of Judges. Last week, we were in the prologue to the book of Judges. And so remember we said that what that does, it gives the setting, the context, gives you background. And that's the reason why in the chapter that we looked at last week, chapter 1 and the early part of chapter 2, goes all the way back to the days of Joshua. It's just simply intending to set the stage for what we're getting into as we get into the introduction to the book of Judges. Because remember, from the days of Joshua until the time when Judges was written and so forth, you're talking about some 340 years in between. So when Samuel, who I believe Samuel is the one who wrote the book of Judges, he was giving that prologue, that background to set the scene for what is going to be written in the book of Judges. So that's where we start, by the way, as we get into the introduction of Judges in chapter 2, verse 7 and following. The first thing we'll talk about is we come back to the conclusion to the prologue, because the conclusion to the prologue functions as also an introduction to the book of Judges. And so we'll pick up at verse number 7, where it says to us, so the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua. So in other words, Joshua and his generation, the people served the Lord as long as they were alive to continue to influence them and so forth, who had seen all the great works which the Lord had done for Israel. Now Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died when he was 110 years old, and they buried him within the border of his inheritance at Timnath-Heres in the mountains of Ephraim, on the north side of Mount Gaash. So that just goes back, sets the stage again of reminding us that Joshua and his generation were faithful up until the time of their death. Then we come to verse number 10. Actually, that should be verse number 10 instead of 7 through 10, about the unbelieving generation. And we read here, it says, and when all that generation had been gathered to their fathers. Now, so he's talking about the generation of Joshua and the elders. And I would even say not even just the elders of his day, but the generation of the Jews that had come out of the wilderness, the believing generation, the ones that had been born in the wilderness, the ones that were with Joshua during the whole conquest and the division of the land. When that generation had been gathered to their fathers, when they had died, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel. Now here's an interesting thing. You read that statement, and we get it. There was a generation that Joshua's generation, the wilderness generation that had been born into the wilderness, and they entered into the promised land. They were a faithful generation, all right? They all passed. And then we read this statement that says, and another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, and nor the work that he had done for Israel. And so an interesting thing is when you see that word another, here's what we typically think of. The idea of the word another typically means something else that's coming in sequence. It's next, it's coming behind what was before. It could mean also in addition to whatever was already there or before, okay? And so when you read that another generation arose after them, it means there was a generation that followed, that faithful generation that died, okay? But here's an interesting thing about the word here that's translated another. If you get into the Hebrew text and you look up, okay, what are the different meanings of this word another? Here's what you'll find. It can mean following, so like in sequence or in addition to. It can mean next. But here's what's really interesting. As you go on down through the line of words that can be used to translate this word another, here's what you find. You find following, next, but then the third word is strange. Isn't that interesting? Strange. The idea being that this is a generation that, yes, they followed the generation that was before them that has died off. Okay, they came next, but they also were a strange generation. They were another generation of a different kind. They weren't like the generation prior to them. Well, what's the thing that distinguishes them as being strange, different from the generation that was before them? They did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel. So in other words, this different generation, this strange generation, and it to me, doesn't it strike you as strange that they would not know the Lord, whom their forefathers and foremothers and grandparents and so forth knew and so forth, but they didn't know him. In other words, they didn't have a personal relationship with him. They had no awareness of his greatness, his power, his glory. Now, to me, that's very, very relevant for the age in which we live. Because I'll be honest with you, I did not know that about the word another until I did some word study on it today. And I'm kind of like you. I was reading it. Here's what the word another means in the original Hebrew. Following, next, strange. Strange? Wow. Well, now you understand why. You look in our situation where we are we were just talking about all the testimony that we heard this past Sunday, and even you think about what we heard last year, and what you can go and you can read. All you got to do is take the time, read the Declaration, read the Constitution, so forth and so on. And some people try to put some space between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Let me tell you, the Constitution is just the nuts and bolts to carry out what was stated in the Declaration of Independence. They may be separate, yet they're the same, okay? So you think about our culture. How you ask yourself sometimes, how did we get to where we are? Willfully, but I believe also negligence, neglectful. Because I got a question for you, all right? So thinking about this, that here we've got this generation, Joshua's generation, and so forth, that faithful generation that came out of the wilderness, and so forth. And so down the line, there eventually comes this other generation that doesn't know the Lord, doesn't know the great works that he had done. So I've got here in my notes to say this. We must ask why. Just like I think it's really important for us to stop and ask ourselves in our own country or ask ourselves of our own family, why? How did this happen? So when you think about this generation right here that we're talking about in Judges chapter number 2, when you think about our own personal context and so forth, You ask this question, why? So why do you think that this generation, this strange generation, came along and did not know the Lord or the great things that he had done? How did that happen? Any answers?
Parents didn't talk about it. Well, they had evidence of what was done. They willfully be ignorant or neglected. Just like we do in Washington, we've got all these things that have Bible verses, Ten Commandments, and plastered everywhere. They didn't know. They chose not to. Satan blinded them to that point that they chose not to do that.
To willfully ignore, blow it off.
And took up, in Scripture, they took up the other gods. They supplied a physical desire to the people, and they ran after them instead of following God's plan.
Okay, all right. Anybody else?
Much like we do now, and our parents did, I want it better for my child. So I don't want them to have to suffer or have to experience what I experienced. I want them to have it better than me. And so they don't get to experience it. It's only through those experiences that we really do learn. I mean, we have a generation of X, Y millennials that don't know world conflicts. They don't know truly what it's like to be without. They've had everything instantly. So this generation, similar circumstances, they didn't experience it. And so moms and dads said, well, you're okay. You don't have to. I'll make it better for you. So you don't have to experience it.
Okay, all right. Anybody else? Lucy?
Also worship, oh, I'm sorry.
Good,
They're
good.
also worshiping idols, and they were
Yes.
going what they thought was an easy path into those religions. They felt it was easier for them.
Okay.
Appeal to them.
All right, Lucy?
Yeah, I think, the United States Constitution was based in divorce, right? And the years, I think I was 60s or something, everything little by little they took away, they put God out of them.
Yes.
So little by little, just, people are used to it. And probably just pay attention what the world offer you instead of coming to God. So little by little, it's been strength. I experienced it with my nephews and nieces, and that's because, their parents, little by little, we turning against God, and we are,
So there's a very clear correlation between the degeneration of what's going on here with Israel in the book of Judges and the degeneration that's taking place in the United States. I think there's a couple of things. I think that there was, Don touched on this, and we'll actually see some of that a little bit later on, is that I think that there was a complacency that sat in, that took hold on the parts of families, parents, and so forth, all right? Not practicing the Shema, love the Lord, our God is one Lord, and you shall teach these things to your children, and so forth. There was the willful rebellion and ignorance, rejection of it, and so forth. There was the willful embracing of a pagan culture. And so you can see all of those things right here in the book of Judges with the nation of Israel, and you can see a correlation to the very same things in the degeneration of our own society, okay? And to me, it's as plain as the nose on your face, all right? So we have this unbelieving generation that comes along and doesn't know God, doesn't know about the great things he had done for Israel, all right? And I believe that all those factors were a part of it, okay? So then we come to the summary of Israel's sin of idolatry, because this is really getting to the crux of the matter of what was going on with Israel, okay? In verses 11 through 13, here's what we read. It says, "Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they followed other gods from among the gods of the people, who were all around them. And they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtoreths." So just like what we were saying a minute ago, there's this pagan culture all around them. Now, in the days of Joshua, even in Joshua's days, they weren't 100% effective, faithful, obedient at ridding the land of the Canaanites and so forth. But the difference in Joshua's day is that that generation was at least faithful in worshiping the Lord. They didn't fall into the idolatry and so forth. But as we read right here just a moment ago, it says that these gods were all around them. And the result of that was the result of the fact that Israel, from its beginning in the land, throughout its history in the land, had failed to drive the Canaanites out. Okay? They got complacent. They decided instead of going to war and fighting the battles in order to root them out, they would put them in forced labor and so forth. But they were still involved in their pagan religions. And so, but after the death of Joshua and that faithful generation, Israel fell headlong into the worship of pagan idols. And so you got to ask this question. Now think about it, okay? And I know this is kind of a strange thing for you and me to think about, but why would a person choose to trade a personal, real, living God for a dead, false God that is really nothing more than the creation of their own sinful imagination or somebody else's? Who in their right mind would do that? But that's what happens, isn't it? Now, in this era, and through most of the era of human history, in fact, it even still goes on around the world in different places, where people are still bowing down and worshiping physical idols, okay? You say, okay, well, why would somebody do that? Well, what is an idol after all? Think about, why does somebody worship an idol? What is an idol?
Anything that draws your attention away from God, anything that you put above God.
Okay, but why would somebody worship a dead, lifeless idol? Now, I will admit that the scriptures teach about that in the background. Obviously, there's demonic and satanic influences, to drive you to worship this false god and so forth. But what's the real motivation of why people would worship a dead God? Okay, no consequences. Do what? Okay. Here's what an idol is. Okay, an idol is a god that you can shape into your own image to justify your own motives, desires, agenda, whatever it is. And that's basically at the heart of idolatry. And humanity has a tendency to not want to have to deal with the true God who is going to require us to have to face the reality of our sin and so forth. And so human beings have a tendency to choose in one form or another gods basically made in their own image that they can use to justify whatever it is that they want to do.
Don't human beings have a desire to worship something?
Yes, and that's at the heart of it. There is, because made in the image of God, there is an innate. Here's this word is oftentimes used about human beings. Human beings are incurably religious. Now that's universally true. You have to ask, well, why is that so? You don't find that in any other animal life. It's just unique to human beings. Well, the reason why we're incurably religious is that there is within us a need, but the problem is that so often human beings seek to fill that need in wrong ways. And it oftentimes ends up leading to the false gods.
I just want to throw my 2 cents worth of it in there. Most of us are visual. And what has drawn many of the Israelites into worshiping pagan gods is because the prosperity that they saw in those other nations. They were wealthy, they were productive, because they worshiped this sort of God. So that's number one. I think that's one of the reasons why they started gravitating towards see the prosperity in all the pleasures that they offer and so forth.
Yeah, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But you said something visible. I think part of it has to do with wanting to see what we worship. And the God of the Bible is spirit. Okay? Pam?
Reminds me of legalism, that I want God in my life my way. And these gods were sun, moon, stars, and all this, and it's like, could they compromise? Could they have said, well, this is God, and this is like our God who created the world, so I can worship this. And like with Cain and Abel, when Cain did sacrifice the way he wanted to do it instead of the way God told him to do it, the worship and the coming to God was like legalism. I got to do it the way I want to do it. I got to help God out. That's what it reminds.
Okay. So let's get into kind of the heart and what Miguel was touching on right here. I want you to look at the latter part of verse 13. Notice this right here. They forsook the Lord, okay, true, living, personal God, okay, and served Baal and Ashtoreth. And that word, the term Baal, can actually be translated in plural, Baals, because there were different versions and so forth, just like Ashtoreth, the Ashtoreths and so forth. In fact, so Baal, let's talk about Baal. Baal was the Canaanite god who was believed to have control over weather and nature. He was essentially the god of agriculture. And so they worshiped Baal because they wanted their crops to be productive. They wanted their flocks to be productive and healthy and so forth. And they believed that by worshiping Baal, that they would have an abundance of crops, that they would have an abundance of flocks, okay? And in the end, that enriches them, okay? In fact, somebody has said this, I read this today. It said the bottom line with Baal worship was the bottom line. He was the god of personal wealth. So the idea being that if you worship Baal, you're in an agrarian society. So if you're worshiping Baal and you're pleasing him and you're getting his favor, your crops are going to be productive, your flocks are going to be productive, and you're going to become wealthy. Okay? And I mentioned that they can have different versions. Remember when Israel was on their way to the promised land and they came upon Balaam? Remember Balaam, the false prophet? They were at Baal of Peor. All right? And so they had their own special version of the Baal god. That's kind of what they do. Here's the thing. The term Baal means Lord. It means owner. It can even mean husband. So now think about that. All three of those terms, are you wanting to change your name to Baal or something there? So think about this. Think about this, all right? God had a relationship with Israel in all three of those terms. He was their Lord, their master. He's their owner by creation and otherwise. Redemption, bringing them out of Egypt, okay? And there are passages in the Old Testament in which the relationship between God and Israel is likened to that of marriage. I have betrothed you unto me. The whole book of Hosea is a picture about Hosea and his wife who goes off into harlotry, prostitution, but it's a picture that is intended to portray the relationship between God and Israel, okay? That same language applies to us in our relationship with Jesus. Is he not our Lord and our master? Is he not our owner? Do we not? You have been bought with a price. You do not belong to yourself. You have been bought with a price, redeemed. Is he not our groom as the bride? So you see that when they decided to turn from worshiping Yahweh and they turned to worship Baal, they were rejecting the God of their fathers, the God of the covenant, for this false dead God as the Lord, owner, and husband. Okay? Then you come to the Ashtoreths, or Ashtoreth. Also, Asherah is another term that you find in the Old Testament to describe this god. The Greek version was Astarte. You probably have heard that term, Astarte. Okay? Ashtoreth was a Canaanite idol who was believed to be the goddess of sensual love, sex, fertility, maternity. And she was usually worshipped through the priests were typically male prostitutes. Then there were female prostitutes that would have been in the temple. Men would go into these female prostitutes in the temple, engage in sexual intercourse with them with the idea of pleasing Asherah, so that she would in turn bless with children, likewise flocks and so forth and so on. And so these are what we call the fertility gods, the fertility cult. If you ever hear that term being used, that's what it's describing, okay, is the cults of Baal and Ashtoreth. The worship of these fertility gods, especially Ashtoreth, involved perverted sexual practices, profane, obscene, lewd sexual imagery, and in the most drastic versions of it, it also included child sacrifice, which, by the way, Israel eventually in the future falls into. Okay? Now remember something. We've talked about this through Joshua. We've talked about it in Judges. God wanted the Canaanites driven out of the land. Why? Because this is exactly what he did not want to happen. He knew that if the Canaanites were not driven out of the land, knowing human nature, and especially if human nature remains in a sinful condition before God, not repenting and not in relationship with him, the alternative is that's what the human nature is going to pursue. And that's exactly the reason why he wanted them out of there. F.B. Meyer, I've quoted him several times lately. Let me give you a quote from F.B. Meyer thinking about what we just talked about. He said this, because here's the important thing for you and me. All right, it's good for us to go back and we're learning, all right, here's the history. This is what the book of Judges is. This is why these things were happening, and this is why, and so forth and so on. But we always have to bring it up, and we have to apply it to ourselves. FBR makes this statement right here. He said this, quote, "We worship other gods, the gods of the nations around the idols of the marketplace, the studio, the camp, and the bar." Let me say that again. He said, we. Now talking about they. We worship other gods, the gods of the nations around the idols of the marketplace, the studio, the camp, and the bar. What's the point that Meyer is making in that statement? Let me read it again. We worship other gods, the gods of the nations around the idols of the marketplace, the studio, the camp, and the bar. What's he saying? We're not immune to the temptation of idolatry. We're not immune to it. You see, because we have this idea in our mind that to worship an idol, you've got to be bowing down to something made out of metal, some image made out of gold or silver or stone or wood. Okay? That's the picture we have of idolatry. You can be guilty of idolatry. We can be guilty of idolatry, and you never bow down to anything like that. Let me give you some verses of Scripture right here. I'd encourage you to write these down. Colossians 3:5. Luke chapter 12, verse 15. So Colossians 3:5, Luke 12:15, and Exodus chapter 20, verse 17. Now, I'm going to read those for you. Colossians 3:5 says this. This is Paul. He says, "Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, what is of this world." Okay? Sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and last of all, he says, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Luke chapter 12, verse 15 says this. This is Jesus speaking. "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses." Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, the 10th of the 10 commandments. The Lord said, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor." What's the common thread in those three verses? Covetousness. What is covetousness? What does it mean to covet something? Do what? All right, envy. Okay, all right. Wanting what somebody else has. Here's what Paul says. That's idolatry. You ever been guilty? See somebody's got something over there, or maybe they've got some privilege that you don't have. Maybe they've got the money to go do things that you'd like to do. And you kind of think, boy, that ought to be me. Why do they get to go? I ought to be one going on that cruise. That's covetousness. And that's idolatry. You realize that? That's what F.B. Meyer is saying. Now, he was speaking in a period of time and differently. He talks about the studio, but that's Hollywood entertainment and so forth. At the camp, the bar, and so forth and so. But the idea being is none of us are immune to idolatry. In fact, that's the reason why the Ten Commandments are summed up with that statement right there, because it's kind of the all-inclusive. Last of all, we're going to conclude with this right here. Here we find the judgment of Israel's sin of idolatry. Verse 14. "And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and so he delivered them into the hands of plunderers who despoiled them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies." Now you got to think about this. So he delivered them into the hands of plunderers. Why? Why did he do that? He could just as easily have continued to have protected them from those that spoil, if only they would have been faithful to him. But they had so persisted and become so corrupt that he finally decided, the only way for me to deal with this is let them experience the pain of their choices. The consequences, we talked about that, right? The consequences of choices. So he delivers them into the hand of plunderers, sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for calamity, as the Lord had said, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were greatly distressed. Now, you remember we've talked about on two different occasions that Moses commanded Joshua that when you get into the land of promise, you are to go to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Remember we looked at that a few weeks ago. From one mountain, You will gather Israel between the two mountains. From one mountain you will pronounce the blessings upon them, that if only they will be faithful to me, I will give you these blessings. But he said, on the other mountain, from the other mountain, you will pronounce the cursing, that if you are unfaithful to me. It's not like God had not been straight up and honest with them. They had been forewarned. Remember this, God's purpose in this was not punishment in and of itself, but ultimately repentance on the part of Israel. It was a demonstration of God's love for Israel. Tough love. Now, I know I made reference to this back some weeks ago in Hebrews chapter number 12. I'll make reference to that in just a minute. But for those of us that are parents and, you raise kids and so forth, and for some of us that are involved in helping to raise grandchildren, you love them. Do anything in the world for them. But sometimes love's got to be tough. And sometimes they have to understand there are some serious and painful consequences that come along with the choices that you've made, especially when you have been told so. I made reference to Hebrews chapter 12. It says, verse 5, and you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens, and he scourges every son whom he receives. And I want you to notice this. In that one text right there, it says, verse 7, if you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons, as his children. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? And that statement is made with this understanding. Any father, any mother who loves their children corrects them when they are wrong, when they have disobeyed. And you do it because you love them, not because you enjoy doing it, not because you enjoy inflicting discomfort of whatever kind it may be upon them. You do it because you love them. If you don't teach them otherwise, it could lead to worse things. What son is there whom a father does not chasten? I came across a story, and I want to read this right here. I'm going to conclude with this, just to kind of give you an example. Back in the mid-1990s, I come across this today. There was a beautiful young woman. Her name was Shannon Wilsey. She was a very popular actress in pornographic films. As a 23-year-old young woman, and when I read this, I Googled her name, and I also came across a Los Angeles Times report that deals with this. And I saw pictures of her, clothed, all right, let me say. She was a beautiful woman. She was beautiful. At the age of 23, she was making all kinds of crazy money as a result of her doing these pornographic films and so forth. She just was living high on the hog. She owned a white Corvette. She was driving it back to her home, apparently on the road leading her home, very close to her home. She wrecked the Corvette. In the wreck, she apparently hit a fence, and the fence came and it hit her face. It messed up her face. She somehow managed to make it to her house. She called a friend who oftentimes was there to help get her out of jams and trouble she was all the time getting in. And she said, I need help. I'm in trouble. And so this lady didn't rush over there because she's kind of like, yeah, it's kind of the same old stuff. Well, she gets there, she finds her in the garage laying in a pool of blood. But her face has been basically disfigured. So the friend gets her up off the floor, gets her into the house, kind of starts trying to clean her up and so forth. The young woman, Shannon, asked her friend to take her dog out for a walk And while her friend is out walking the dog, before she gets back, she takes a gun and she shoots herself in the head, kills herself. I found this Los Angeles Times article, and it said, after crashing her white Corvette and injuring her much glorified face on the way home from another night of hard partying, Shannon Wilsey sent her friend out to walk her Rottweiler, Daisy, and then shot herself in the head. Though a success by some standards, the detective investigating her death said, I think her whole life caused this suicide. Shannon bragged about doing crazy things, yet she told a close friend, now listen to this, this is the parent-loving part, okay? She told a close friend that she wished her mother would have stopped her. The friend said she felt bad because her mother didn't say anything about her being in the pornography business. Couldn't you imagine that? A parent not at least saying something? You got to wonder, a parent who doesn't at least want to say something, do you really love that kid? It goes on, after her suicide, an unmailed letter was found where she described what she wished her dad would have done. Quote, where were you when I was dating rock star Greg Allman when he was 25 years older than me? She started dating Greg Allman, who was 25 years older than her, and she was still a teenager. And she's asking this question, Daddy, where were you? Where were you when I was on heroin? Where were you when I started doing porno movies? The dad said he would have been there had she only asked. Here's my point. It reminds me of a situation that I came across not too long ago about a family. Their daughter's living with them. She's an adult. She's got a couple of kids. Husband leaves. She's looking for guys online and stuff like this. Meets a guy online. Goes off on a trip to Oklahoma with him. That doesn't last. So anyway, when that happened, I was talking to her family, and they made the comment. Her dad said to me, well, you know, she would always just bring men home while she's living with them. And I'm like, when hell freezes over, no way, no how. Not in my house. What are you doing? Is that a dad? Mom? That really is demonstrating love for the welfare of their kids? Now, you may not change the behavior, but to at least take a stand and say something and try and fight some battles if you have to. See, my point being is God had to let Israel suffer for their choices, not because he took delight in the punishment and the suffering, but it was his way of saying, you can't do this and get by with it. There are consequences. And the fact of the matter is, he deals with us in a similar manner, doesn't he? We may grumble and complain when the Lord's given us a good spanking, but what we ought to really be thankful for is that he loves us enough to correct us. Now, ultimately what we do with it is going to be on us. But God himself would be negligent if he didn't at least try to get our attention. Okay? All right, we're going to stop right there. We'll pick up at verse 16 next week. All right, any questions, thoughts? Don?
Like what Bob said earlier, our culture today says love is easy. We won't do anything to impede you. You hear all kinds of love, don't judge.
Yeah.
And that's what this culture is today. Is if you love somebody, it's all easy. There's no discipline or requirements.
Yeah.
That's where we're at.
I have written in my Bible an equation. Love equals grace and truth. If it's lacking either one, it's not godly love. Godly love always involves grace and truth.
And I think a lot of issues, especially I think in the church too, is kind of goes back to what you said, is we want things on our terms. So even though, we read of the God of love, mercy, and forgiveness that has these unconditional promises that he's made to Israel, he also has conditional ones based on how they behave. And I mean, it doesn't mean he's contradicting himself. It's just there's unconditional ones that he's going to do no matter what we do, and then there's promises that he has to keep dependent upon what we do to kind of still keep that holiness there.
So much of the problem with Christians today is rather than getting our information from the Word, we're getting it from culture. That's the problem. I shared this with somebody the other day. I remember early on when I was a young preacher, I read this. It said, the responsibility of the pastor is to catch the spirit of his age. And the guy who wrote that, who was quoting it, he said, God help the pastor who does. The responsibility of the pastor is not to catch the spirit of his age, it's to be caught by the Spirit of God. And that's true of believers, all believers, okay? All right, God bless. Thank y'all so much for joining us online. We're going to conclude. Have a great evening. Okay, Brother Randy couldn't be with us tonight.